Welcome to another NJ Thrives Thursdays. We have this every Thursday at 12 p.m. And I believe in a week, or I think it's 2 weeks from now, we're going to have our first NJ Thrives Tuesdays, which is more for personal development. So Thursdays is going to be business, Tuesdays is going to be personal development. So we're working both ends of the spectrum here. I'm your host, Christian Pichardo, NJSBDC marketing consultant and CEO at nilmomedia.com. And if you don't already know, the NJSBDC is a statewide program that's powered by the SBA and partners to help small businesses in New Jersey with no-cost small business consulting, training and events starting at $0, and exclusive small business resources only available to our clients. So today's agenda is, as always, we're going to go through a couple headlines. We'll jump into the webinar, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So for the headlines, there wasn't very much, many new programs. Most of it is just NJEDA or our governor adding more money to existing programs. So this is just one example of that, where $20 million was approved for the Main Street micro business loan. So, you know, if they ran out of funds before, you have a chance to grab one of these loans now. So that's one headline. The other two headlines I've repeated for several weeks. Again, they haven't changed. So the NJEDA Small Business Lease Grant. So actually, this is news to me. They received a significant number of applications. So this may or may not be available, or you might get a response a little bit delayed. So just be mindful of that, but it seems that this is still open and you could still apply for it as long as you are eligible. So just make sure that you can see all those details. And the SBA disaster loans. So the SBA has multiple types of loans, and down here you could see the types. The ones that are mostly related to business are obviously this one, business physical disaster loans, which are I believe these are catered to people who experience physical damages for the storms that we had not too long ago. And then the economic injury disaster loans, which are more related to COVID-19. So there you have those for the SBA. And those are our headlines. Now, 3 things to keep in mind before we jump into the webinar is to type your questions into the Q&A box. If you put them into the regular chat, then they might get lost in the conversation. So Q&A chat, you can ask as yourself or anonymously there. Number 2 is you're going to get redirected to a survey right after this webinar, so don't exit out. And it takes 3 minutes. And once you're done, you're going to get access to the recording and materials of this webinar. And number 3, just by joining, this webinar, you're eligible for the Upgrade Your Business certificate. So more details on that at the link below. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome back Arash. He is Associate Professor at Supply Chain Management Department at Rutgers Business School. And he's going to show us today supplier development for small businesses in the age of COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate the introduction, and pleasure to be joining you guys again. It's always fun to see familiar faces, and of course, we have been working with NJSBDC for quite a bit of time. You guys do a great job, and I sure hope that the participants today benefit. I'll just reiterate something that Chris mentioned just a little while ago about your type of business. Thank you, Clarence, on mentioning the automation engineering firm for manufacturing. So I'll try and cater some of the topics related to that. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. So without further ado, if everyone is ready, I'm just going to try and set up my screen share with the slides.
We do have someone else that mentioned that their business is a catering and event company. So,
oh, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing that. Those are both fitting. And again, I'll try and adjust and mention a few things. But again, if you have questions, I'll try and have the chat ready. But I know Chris has done a great job in the past in sharing what might come from the audience. So I appreciate that, Chris. Okay, so I just kind of kept the title of the presentation simple, and I'll try and, of course, cater it to the current events as it stands. Although we really don't have to work hard to apply COVID to supply chain. It's fascinating how these days, any day of the week that I turn on the TV and any channel, the term supply chain seems to be on everyone's mind, supply chain shortages and supply chain disruptions. So I think people are recognizing that getting their goods and services in a grocery store or in a retail establishment or elsewhere is not just a matter of one entity working on it. Rather, there are significant suppliers upstream that help out. And so the general topic that we're going to be talking about is sometimes these suppliers, especially small business, do need help. And it is beneficial to larger organizations. Generally, we call those focal firms, should be able to assess suppliers and see if there's a merit in developing or helping to develop them. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, and especially given the circumstances of this environment. Going to the next slide. So I think Chris mentioned the overview for NJSBDC, so I won't mention that too much regarding my background. I'll spend just a couple of seconds on this. There's not much of a reason for grandstanding here. You can look up my credentials online. I'm an associate professor with Rutgers Business School. I run a research laboratory on supply chain disruptions, of all things. I'm keynote speaker and panelist on resilience, business continuity, and supply chain disruptions. That's generally my focal area. And really interorganizational response, what I mean by that is how buyers and suppliers work together to help with recovery efforts, and especially related to nonprofit organizations. So anybody attending that is from an NGO, be happy to exchange ideas regarding. I do experiments, which basically is behavioral experiments, so to speak. And of course, I've got, it's getting to be around 40 publications in operations and supply chain journals, some of which are in top journals, but I have my fair share of decent enough articles and on supplier development as well. And then I also am on a board of an NGO that's focused on safety and preparedness. So a little bit of background about myself. Supplier development and purchasing, the overlap there. What is it about, and what can we expect? So that's the general. This is why you guys are here. Let's see. Looks like Cynthia is post-consumer recyclables, PCRs, very good. I appreciate that. And Ayana is a digital illustrator, print stickers and merchandising. So I appreciate that. That's very good. I'll try to incorporate as much as I can for those particular types of businesses. So what is supplier development? Defining it. Really, SD is any kind of an activity or initiative or investments that is set forth by the buyer to enhance the supplier, their performance. Anytime we try and help out with a supplier with money, with equipment, with training materials, simply advice, that becomes part of what is considered supplier development. Even proactive auditing and proactive monitoring, so long as it's not really meant to be penalizing, rather a developmental form. So that becomes essentially supplier development. The extent of these investments can be small and short term, or large and long term. And again, we're going to be talking about when and whom with which these investments make sense. But supplier development initiatives can be quite risky. And so you're welcome to make your comments in the chat area. I'll leave it open as far as the riskiness, as to why some organizations, some businesses may be somewhat reluctant in doing so. Let's see. Actually, I seem to have a bit of a problem with this slide. It's okay. We can skip that and we'll go to the more important one. Usually we break down supplier development into 3 types. As I mentioned, they could be long-term and short-term. And so, but one way to break them down is indirect and direct, and I'll explain each one of these separately, and limited and extensive. So let's talk about type 1, which is limited and indirect. What are some examples of these? Type 1, limited and indirect, very strong formal supplier evaluations. Those become limited and indirect. It could be that we would actually do an audit of suppliers. Again, once the purpose of the audit becomes a penalty, then it's not really about development. Any kind of a feedback that is provided to the supplier's performance is considered limited and indirect, because we're not directly involved with the supplier. And many firms do that. In fact, oftentimes this feedback is compared and contrasted to other suppliers. I've seen matrices of different suppliers' performance set side by side. You can anonymize them, and so that one supplier can see how others are doing, and it's a comparable element. Setting improvement targets, right? Saying we need to improve your cost by X%, or the level of quality by Y%. All of those can be considered a supplier development. Performance objectives and performance goals. Sometimes organizations provide certificates or even awards, and so those become a form of recognition. And many suppliers like that. I'm sure for small businesses, such as the ones that we have presence here, I'm sure be it Cynthia or Ayana or others, they would love to see some kind of an award provided by a big name, right? Let's say Office Depot's Supplier of the Year. That can actually carry quite a bit of weight. So that's essentially a form of supplier development, but it is limited and it is indirect. And of course, similar to evaluation, there are rating systems. So these are type 1s. Let's go to type 2. I'm so sorry. Oh, here we go. Yeah, okay. So that's interesting. I had a duplication. Sorry about that. So actually, before I go to type 2, let's talk about evaluations, because that becomes important beyond supplier development. Recognizing how different suppliers are evaluated depending on their importance, is something that anyone in purchasing, or actually anyone in sales on the supplier side, needs to be aware of. Let's see. Okay, so Quincy has a question wondering how this development can be linked to CSR, ESG, and capacity building for disadvantage. Oh, yes. So with regards to corporate social responsibility, yes, oftentimes many organizations recognize any kind of green activity or humanitarian activity, any social activity by suppliers. And that allows the supplier to be recognized as a potential for development and assistance. And of course, it's good for the business as well to do so. These days, especially, it has become quite important. Green suppliers, given the focus on sustainability and global warming and whatnot, is one way to show yourself as a potential supplier that can benefit from development activities. But back to evaluations. I'll mention these briefly, and then if you're interested, just send me an email. I'll be happy to share some material with you. Supplier scorecards can be categorical, and these are very simple. Really, this is about green, yellow, and red type of evaluation. Green, the supplier doing a great job, no problem. Yellow is a supplier that could be improved upon. Perhaps they need to adjust their performance slightly. And red is one that is quite unacceptable. So, do better or else type of a supplier. Categorical supplier scorecards, those are typically used by small businesses or startup businesses, or ones that just don't have a lot of resources. Categorical is also used for suppliers that are just not that important, right? So for suppliers of, let's say, paper clips, just paper clips, right? Or pens and pencils, it might not be necessary for me to, do significant amount of evaluation. Then we have weighted scores, and this is no different than typically how I grade my students, weight scores, but for imagine midterm and participation and class exercises, etc. So for suppliers, it could be cost, quality, delivery, right? Flexibility. And we place a different weight. Let's say if we're cost focused, we place significant amount of percentage of the weight on cost. If we're focused on quality, it might be higher. And then we weigh the score based on that. It takes a little bit more time to do so, but oftentimes it gives us a better assessment of overall dimensions. There's a third one that's rarely used by small companies. It's usually reserved for the Targets, the Walmarts of the world, and that's cost-based. And they literally look through the performance of the supplier, and anytime there's a issue, let's say with late delivery or quality issues, they associated a cost with this. Let's say that a truck that was supposed to be delivering the parts from a particular supplier is late 4 hours. Someone within Walmart sits down and figures out how much that's costing Walmart, and that actually goes into the performance of the supplier. You can imagine how that takes quite a bit of time and effort to do so, but that's one way to do supplier scorecards. So this is a very, very small, let's say, appetizer on supplier scorecards and supplier monitoring, supplier evaluation. I just wanted to give you that background because that really feeds right into supplier development. And so that allows us, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Professor. I want to give a reminder to the audience that we had a previous event with you where you went through these scorecards, how to do them, how to do each one with examples. So if anyone needs the link to our YouTube channel, let us know in the chat, but it's going to be all in there.
That's exactly right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the reminder there. So then, we can benchmark with other small businesses in terms of how the suppliers have been doing. And then we can nurture relationships with suppliers that are strategic, and also explain the strategic and bottleneck suppliers in just a second. Those are high-risk suppliers. So that is essentially a background on type 1. And then the type 2 is limited in terms of a resource investment, but it is direct. So it can be, we can incorporate elements from from the type 1 program, plus routine visits to the supplier by the plant, in terms of quality, engineering, and purchasing personnel, advice as related to suppliers, such as inspection of equipment, QA procedures, advice in terms of manufacturing related, especially, let's say, in the car industry, because we do want to have type processes for suppliers, because their quality obviously resonates into parts that are used in manufacturing cars. So processes, machining process, machine setups, any kind of engineering advice that is provided becomes part of that. And then just technology advice, technological advice, which relates to information technology, software, material, all of that can be part of a type 2 limited but direct type of supplier development. Then we have type 3, which is extensive and direct. Direct meaning we're face-to-face with the supplier, we get engaged with them, right? And that is, and it's quite extensive. So really about stationing personnel at a supplier site to help them with process improvements. And in fact, Honda does a pretty extensive job regarding that. So does John Deere. At one point, they had something like 300, what they called supplier engineers. And so these engineers would actually be stationed. They would really never have to go to John Deere's headquarters or facilities, because they were stationed at the supplier, and they would help out the supplier in terms of quality improvement and whatnot. Now, there is a caveat here. Sometimes suppliers like this, right? Because they're getting free training. Sometimes they are not too excited about that, because they don't necessarily like people sticking their nose into their business. So you have to be a bit correct in terms of approach, recognizing that I'm here to help rather than to simply just audit and get you in trouble, so to speak. Extensive and direct can also relate to training employees of the supplier at your facility. So really, let's say flying over, having employees of the supplier come to a Toyota plant, come to a Honda plant, or come to a J&J plant and actually see how the pharmaceutical manufacturing is conducted there. And the transfer of employees between the two firms to increase knowledge exchange. There's literally an exchange program that could be provided. And then, financial assistance for investment in technology. That's probably something that many small businesses are interested in. Apple does quite a bit of this, especially with their foreign manufacturing suppliers. And so they provide assistance for technology, and they buy tools, if you will, for some of their suppliers. So that becomes type 3. So now the question is, which one of these would a supplier expect, and how does a manufacturer decide on going about doing so? But before we go to essentially deciding which of the 3 types, right, type 1, type 2, or type 3, one would expect, let's talk about a general, what are some of the benefits and some of the risks. Remember, I kind of planted the seed of thinking about what would be a manufacturer's concern as far as supplier development risks. Number 1, and this comes from North Carolina State University's research, you can expect a sourcing cycle time reduction. And they have some percentages there that I didn't want to bombard you with numbers, but a good % reduction in cycle time, right? Which is important, right? For overall operations. Same thing with time to market. Remember, time to market is not about manufacturing. Time to market is about product development. So time to market is essentially how long it takes from back of the napkin type of a design for me to develop a hybrid car or a brand new cell phone or whatever else. And so that becomes important. If I'm working with suppliers and my suppliers are well developed, I can expect to be able to do products faster. Reducing inventories, right? Of course, these days we don't have enough inventory, but a lot of times supply chain management is about making sure that there's adequate inventory without not too much sitting in the shelves and causing expirations or whatever else it might be, damages in the warehouse, etc. Quality, reliability improvements. Again, manufacturability of new designs is another potential benefit. So it's a combination of time to market and sourcing cycle time reduction. And that's pretty straightforward, right? When you think about it, if my supplier and I can talk to one another better, if we understand each other's technical terms, then certainly it becomes a potential for improvement. And finally, responsiveness to my own customers' needs and market dynamics. Again, through communication, through understanding, I'm able to change and adjust to what the customers need. All right, so then we go on to my favorite slide is why doesn't everybody do this, right? Number one, of course, it's costly. It takes quite a bit of time and effort. But the concerns become the fact that, gee, what happens if a supplier uses the funds that I've provided, the financials, and actually uses it for marketing, uses it for recruiting other businesses or in other lines of business, right? So how do we combat that? You can generally put some kind of a clause and work closely with the supplier to make sure that the funds are done correctly. Again, here, trust becomes very important, and I'll be mentioning trust over and over again, because without it, right, there becomes limited benefit in providing funding or resources without expectation of anything in return. So second, supplier uses the technology for the betterment of companies who compete with the buyer, right? So again, the supplier is providing technology that is meant to produce parts and items for one's own competitor. LG provides the supplier development, but now the supplier is using the money to provide good parts for Samsung. It seems a bit counterintuitive, but generally speaking, when you look at the big picture, that's a-okay, believe it or not. Honda, John Deere, Toyota, the big names that are well known for supplier development, when they get asked this question, they always say high tide raises all boats. And so here you almost have to be a bit more altruistic with regards to how the industry perceives it. And yes, so what if your technology is helping the competitors gain a slight bit of improvement? At the end of the day, that's not really going to cut back on your own profitability, because in order to be competitive, one needs to be more than just looking to the current technology. And of course, there's limited to the type of technology that one shares with suppliers anyway, right? There's core technology that stays. Intel is not going to share their core technology about how to make central processing units except for very, very few suppliers. And so when sensitive information is shared, that is again shared with trusted suppliers. There are some barriers, right? If there is no trust with the supplier, like I mentioned, that becomes a barrier to supplier development. There are other competing initiatives, meaning that I only have set number of funds, no manufacturer has free funds to throw around. And so maybe I'm better off improving my own folks and training my own internal employees instead of suppliers. So that's fair enough. And lastly, there just isn't enough opportunity for me to have monitoring and control systems to be able to find out if the supplier is actually being developed or not. That's a bit myopic, right? It's important to place enough monitoring and control resources to double check and to validate, right? But nevertheless, that becomes a risk for that. As far as the copy of the slides, I'm sure the administrative staff at NJSBDC will provide you, and you're welcome to ask for, and I'll be happy to share a link if need be as well. So, but thank you for asking the question. All right. So how do we differentiate? How does a typical manufacturer differentiate between suppliers? We talked about this in a different video, but it's important to bring this up. This is what we call the portfolio matrix for suppliers, and it applies very well here, right? Suppliers are not created equal. God created men and women, all of us the same, but God did not create suppliers to be equal. Some are more important than others. And so one way to break this down in a 2x2 simple matrix is consider the portfolio matrix or the Kralik matrix. And it depends on the value potential and also their risk to the supplier. On the bottom left-hand corner is what's considered non-critical or routine suppliers. These are suppliers that really provide items that are not just commodity, but readily available and don't have that much of a value for me. They have limited risk. If I don't have the part, it's not going to create that significant of an issue. Like I mentioned, pens and paper clips, right? Usually that's not going to create much of an issue in how a business operates. They also have a low value potential. In other words, if I work with a supplier, developing the supplier, I'm just not going to get much of a benefit. You're not going to add much of a technology by having a office supply, a supplier enhance. And so let me see if I have, so this is non-critical, low risk, have a low impact on organizational profitability. And not only do pens and papers not have a significant impact on the business, but their absence does not create a serious threat. So typically the sourcing strategies that we used here is on efficiency and reducing administrative burden. The supplier development is really not this important here. And we use electronic auctioning and catalogs to direct responsibilities of buying these items. Let's take a look at the second one, and that is on the far opposite, and that is the strategic supplier, right? Strategic suppliers are suppliers that have high risk, but also high profit impact or value, and they are critical to the business. They're usually only a handful of suppliers. So for instance, if I am manufacturing laptops, the manufacturer of a central processing unit becomes a critical or strategic supplier. For Boeing, the jet engine becomes a strategic item, right? So I work very, very closely with these suppliers.
Can we say also Foxconn to Apple?
Yes, very much so. Foxconn to Apple would be a strategic supplier. It's almost like a marriage, right? We have very high commitments to one another, and if one fails, the other one is likely to see significant drop in performance, unfortunately. But if one succeeds, then certainly there's a potential for the other to succeed as well. And so managing these suppliers requires a wide array of skills, product development, quality, even marketing. And so here you can see how supplier development can be an important tool in the toolbox to not only enhance the supplier's performance, but also the relationship. And for strategic items, each contract is unique and focuses on the shared gains between the partners. We use strategic suppliers to develop innovations, be it on the side of product or within the processes. And especially on the process side, again, supplier development becomes important. If Boeing helps, let's say GE jet engines to enhance how they improve or manufacture their jet engines with lighter material, then certainly that helps Boeing as well. So here, supplier development really makes a difference. So from a small business standpoint, and by the way, strategic items don't have to be large items. Qualcomm has a very small chip, but it becomes a very strategic item in many regards. And so small business can also be strategic to organizations. What else do we have? We talked about high value potential and high risk. We talked about low value potential and low risk. But then there are also suppliers that are what we consider bottleneck. These are high risk, but have a very low value potential. So let's take a look at bottleneck items. There's a high risk, but profitability or value is pretty low. Here, the upper hand is with the supplier, the strength is with the supplier. And the reason for that is that the market only has one or very few suppliers to work with. And so that becomes a concern. And so the supplier can force high prices and expectations for service to be low, right? What are examples of a bottleneck supplier? I mentioned Qualcomm, right? Qualcomm has patents. When it comes to patents, Qualcomm can sell these patents and chips to any of the cell phone manufacturers, right? And if it doesn't like the pricing offered by one of the cell phone manufacturers, too bad. It's going to move on to another one. Another example of well, let me just stop here because we're going to run short on time, but any type of a business that is significantly dependent on a bottleneck on a supplier becomes essentially the supplier is considered a bottleneck supplier. Here, the supplier absorbs a lot of the buyer's time compared to any of the other segment. You really have to babysit and take care of the supplier. As a small business, as a supplier, if you can become a bottleneck supplier, that's great, right? Let's say that you're running a restaurant and Black Angus beef is selling like hotcakes in your restaurant, but you can really get that beef from a particular supplier. Kobe beef, for instance, comes from Japan, if I'm not mistaken, or you're selling buffalo or whatever else it might be. And that supplier is the only one that can provide that. You can imagine how you really have to cater and take care of that supplier. And so for the buyer, demand for the relationship is high. Here, supplier development makes a lot of sense. In fact, you would do that happily and readily, right? Because your strategy is to minimize risk of any kind of an outage and to limit the damage. Now, long term, the buyer really would like to replace the item and perhaps find an alternative to a buyer, another type of, that should be another type of supplier, because again, we want to minimize the dependency. But in the short run, I don't have much of a choice but to accept that. So you can see how that becomes a bottleneck supplier, low value potential. We're not going to get much out of it, but the risk is so high that it is a good idea to develop supplier development. The last item is leverage items. And these are items that have high profitability, but the risk factor is pretty low. What is an example? Sheet metal that goes into a car, or the plastic covering that goes into many of the electronic parts that we manufacture are essentially leverage items. I can buy these from a lot of different places, right? They're important to my business, but they're not that critical because I can find another source pretty easily. So it's a commodified part. There's an abundance of suppliers, and here the buyer has the upper hand and the power in the relationship. So here, you know, reluctantly would I spend significant amount of time and effort on the supplier, and therefore supplier development becomes less of a tool in my toolbox, so to speak. So that essentially is how I would play the leverage item. Sometimes if the leverage item can provide good profitability and good value add, it is possible for me to, as a buyer, to invest in the supplier, but oftentimes I'm reluctant to do so. So that's essentially the breakdown. Now, that's what I mentioned in terms of the 2x2 is somewhat simplifying the different elements, right? There are different aspects to the working environment that also have an effect. So I have probably more exercises that we're going to go through, but let's try this, and you can play along. I'll give it a little bit of time for you to read through this little tiny case study and see what you think of it. I'll read it out loud. Hopefully that's okay with you. And then let's see if in the chat area anybody has an opinion on it. You're working for a company that operates in a very dynamic environment. What's a dynamic environment? It's a changing environment. Let's say it's a cell phone manufacturing company or an industry, right? Or a garment, right? Where fashion changes quite rapidly. Products become obsolete in the industry quite rapidly. Actions of your company's competitive element is your company are difficult to predict. And to keep up with the company, your company has to change its marketing practices quite often. And so now, which of the 4 types of the suppliers that we mentioned, green, blue, orange, and yellow, or right, which one of the 4 would it make sense in this type of an environment to invest in terms of supplier development? Any ideas?
Yeah, I would say definitely the bottleneck supplier or strategic supplier.
In most cases, the strategic and the bottleneck suppliers become pretty prevalent. Now, if I'm working in a static environment where things don't change as much, then perhaps it might make sense for me to think about long term. So in a static working environment, I might expand the type of supplier that I would work with. In those cases, I might actually have some benefit in even incorporating leverage suppliers in there, because it's not just short term. I might gain some of the things in the long run, right? So yes, strategic and bottleneck usually do apply, but moving from dynamic to more static environment, you know, what is a static environment? If we're making ice cream, any kind of a food item, you know, let's say washing, what do they call it? Cleaning material for the house. You know, there's just not much innovation there. Toilet paper, right? These days we talk about toilet paper quite often, or exactly. And so it makes sense for me to work with leverage suppliers in terms of chemicals that are used for, let's say, making pulp and paper. So that essentially is one way to look at it. But there are other characteristics that unfortunately we won't have time to necessarily go through. But working with the buyers, you can kind of get a sense of what to expect. If you're providing services, you know, you can consider a small service providing supplier. You can consider a small provider of supplies and goods, right? Differentiating between those depends on how important they are, where they lie. So those are and some of the priorities of the business. Other characteristics, if you're making a complicated product versus a simple product, right? A complicated product is, you know, again, electronics come to mind. A simple product you know, what I have in front of me, a wallet, or let's say a keychain or whatever else. Those are perhaps, you know, the type of supplier that I have might not merit developing supplier or placing supplier development on it. Domestic suppliers versus international suppliers. Those are also one way for businesses to consider. Again, it depends on the nature and the culture of the organization, the buyer, to consider that. And a small supplier versus a medium-sized supplier. Usually, small suppliers do actually gain an advantage simply because the level of investment in small supplier necessary can be quite beneficial. Small suppliers are happy with fractions of what's necessary for a medium-sized supplier to be considered. So small suppliers can be a good one. And on the small supplier side, you know, oftentimes it's a matter of asking to say, do you have a program? Have you considered nurturing and developing your suppliers, or what can I do for you to consider me as a potential supplier for development? So all of that becomes important to consider. You know, we're hitting right around the 50-minute mark, so I'll finish up here, and then we can have a discussion. I see at least one comment showing up already, which is great. So the key takeaways here. Supplier development is really not free. It takes time. It takes finances from the buyer side, but it also requires effort and time by the supplier. So perhaps I forgot to mention this, the willingness of the supplier to be part of this supplier development program is also important. Many suppliers are interested. Some suppliers might not just be interested. So that's something to consider. Much of this development to stick depends on trust, right? Because we're, again, helping one another, but it is subjective and long-term in terms of the rewards. So supplier development does need to be carefully assessed based on the industry, based on the operating environment, and the type of supplier, like I mentioned, with the Kralik matrix and the size of the organization that we're dealing with. But the good news is that when it's done correctly, supplier development can be a very lucrative competitive advantage, right? You're taking suppliers and you're bringing them to your team, right? Essentially, not to use too much of a sports metaphor, because I don't necessarily like using them, but really making sure that you have a good bench on your team that can come to the rescue. And oftentimes when we develop suppliers, they are also available to help out. In fact, there's a famous case for Toyota. You can look it up. It's getting old now, but they had a brake manufacturer, Aisin Seiki, that fell short as far as their ability to deliver. But Toyota had invested a significant amount of effort and time in helping other suppliers. And so when Aisin basically went down, I think they had a plant fire or something, and then other suppliers chimed in and said, hey, you know, we can actually jump in and make the parts that they cannot, right? So it's essentially goodwill around the supply chain. So, and that, of course, was a competitive advantage for Toyota in unfortunate times. So that's essentially what I thought I would share with you guys. So let's see if there are questions or comments that I can.
We do have a few that have popped up. Let me start with Latifa. She asks, I am a small business owner who's still in the middle of figuring out what they want to do. Not sure what you mean. Maybe you're not sure what the supplier would like to do with your relationship with them. If you could just clarify that in the Q&A. Doesn't seem I have any newer questions into the chat. So everyone, this is now the time. We are in a Q&A session. If you could please, submit any questions that you have for Arash now. But I do have a question. When a small business is looking to get started with supplier development, what capabilities should they take into account in their own operations for them to be able to support the supplier?
For suppliers, for small businesses that want to help their own suppliers, that's a very good question. It is often, again, goes back to the type of the supplier. The rules apply the same way, strategic and bottleneck. So you need to identify those suppliers. And the rules are really not that much different, Chris. And probably just as important is to make sure that one recognizes that the supplier is here to stay, that can be trusted, right? And so that the investments that are made are tangible in the short and the long run, right? I'll just make an example that probably would help the audience and all of us. You know, there are companies that provide tuition remission for going back to school. And it used to be back in the old days that there was no caveat with regards to that. But they wouldn't provide that to everyone, right? You almost have to go through some type of a vetting process to say, Chris, he's a nice guy, he's loyal to the company, and so now we're going to spend thousands of dollars for him to get a graduate degree. But if that type of a personality wasn't necessarily there, then there would be some reluctance to do so. So the same thing applies with a small business, right? How good of a relationship do I have with my suppliers? That's first and foremost. And then the last part that I would mention is you want to look at the future, right? You want to look at the growth. Is this supplier going to be in my portfolio going forward in where I want to be? Let's say that
will they be able to scale with you?
Exactly, they can scale with you, and it is in my long-term strategy if I'm making parts for automotive, but I'm also trying to expand out to make, let's say, parts for machinery, then can that supplier also be doing the same? Exactly.
I see. So we have a question by Cynthia, and she asks, what is the best way to find companies that have a supplier development program?
That's great. So oftentimes they're on their website, they mention it, especially if they have an extensive or fairly elaborate website on about supplier management and supplier relationships. But the good old-fashioned cold call is a good way to go about it and say, what type of a program do you have for developing your suppliers? That becomes an important aspect. Larger organizations typically do, but I wouldn't really go out shopping around. Probably the best way is to start with the companies that you're already working with, because supplier development programs don't have to be formalized to be applied. Providing financing or providing assistance and training and whatnot. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything that's written as a policy. If there is a good relationship, you can call up the buying manager or the company and say, hey, is there any way that I can borrow your technical engineer or IT folks for setting up my new network or whatever else it might be. So it doesn't have to be formal, it can be informal.
Great. And Latifat was able to clarify. So her question was in terms of sourcing suppliers. How do you source suppliers?
How do you source suppliers? That goes back to, sometimes it's a matter of supplier evaluation. So of course you have to identify the suppliers. oftentimes that comes from, these days we use Google and websites quite a bit, but through conferences, through industry books, and just by asking. Then what we do is we do a RFI, request for information, right? And so you put together a package to say, dear Mr. Supplier, dear Mrs. Supplier, I would like to know what your capabilities are for, let's say, manufacturing glass for cabinetry that I'm making, or let's say for typical part. And then you usually get catalogs and some information and perhaps pricing on parts. And so then based on that, you identify the top few that of the suppliers that you're interested in, and you start really understanding their business more. You look at their finances, you look at their management capabilities, you look at their employees, maybe even visit their site for important suppliers, for strategic suppliers. And so that's how essentially the selection process goes.
Right, right. And I want to add to that. I know that research could basically be endless, and you could have a list of 100, 1,000 people to reach out, right? So how do you know when you have enough data, and the suppliers that you have on your contact list should be able to negotiate with you?
Right, right. There's a point of saturation when you don't see that much of a difference between the suppliers. Then that's adequate. There's no magic number, but there is a layering, so to speak. The first batch or the first run and the second run. Usually the second run is deeper, right? Finalists, if you will, and those finalists, once you have about 5 of them, that's plenty. Because they're going to do a good job. They're all very, very good suppliers. You're just trying to select the best. No different than looking at resumes, right? For a typical job these days, that an HR manager might go through 300 resumes, right? But they're not going to spend a lot of time on each of the resumes. Believe it or not, 30 seconds is probably too much. But then, they will know the top 10 candidates. And of those top 10 candidates, they might actually invite 5 of them to have, these days, of course, everything's on Zoom, but to come to the office for a full interview. So same process really works for suppliers.
Awesome. Yeah, that really helps to structure the decision-making process on suppliers. Quincy has a question. He asks, how do these relationships assist with strategic marketing and business relationships? How exactly would someone attach these metrics to their bottom line and future projections? He adds that some of it was answered via my question earlier.
Yeah, so with regards to strategic marketing, what I can add is that a supplier should have a very good idea of where their product or service stands with the customer. That's key, right? They should know if the customer is highly reliant on them, dependent on them, then their marketing should be adjusted. If they're just a commodity product manufacturer, then they need to bow their head and be recognizing that the buyer is going to, have the power and guide the relationship.
Perfect. I don't think I see any other questions. That means you did a great job, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
So I guess we're at 1 p.m. We hit it right on the dot. We have many people in the chat saying thank you to you.
You're all welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
We're going to go ahead and close this out. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Next week, we have Rafael Mata. He's an NJSBDC senior consultant. He's going to help you guys get your small business ready for procurement. This is part 2, by the way. Part 1 is on our website, smallbusinesshelp.com. The link, we dropped it in the chat earlier today. So that's for next week. Again, we are the NJSBDC. We've helped 13,000 plus small businesses. We have no cost small business consulting, training and events starting at $0, just like this one, and exclusive small business resources. To get started, go ahead to njsbdc.com/request-counseling. Again, I want to thank you, Arash, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Have a good one, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.